To those of you here with us in the room, listening live online, or even listening to the recording of this event after the fact, we welcome you to the 13th Annual Manchester Wesley Research Center Annual Lecture. First of all, I would like to express my thanks on behalf of the Center to the International Board of Education of the Church of the Nazarene for their generous sponsorship of this lecture, not only this year, but over a number of years now. Alongside that, I would also like to recognize the 13 partner institutions that together make the Manchester Wesley Research Center. The Center is a working partnership of these institutions, each of which are actively engaged in research in the Methodist and Wesleyan traditions. And these partners are Ambrose University, Asbury Theological Seminary, Asbury University, Cliff College, the International Board of Education of the Church of the Nazarene, the John Rylands Library, Nazarene Theological College, Nazarene Theological Seminary, Northwest Nazarene University, Pentecostal Theological Seminary, Point Loma Nazarene University, the University of Manchester, Religions and Theology, subject area, Wesley Seminary at Indiana Wesleyan University. And to add to this, I'd also like to publicly announce our two newest partner institutions, which are Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and Tyndale College and University College and Seminary in Toronto, Ontario. So there's the intellectual and the financial contributions of these partner institutions that have brought the center into existence and make tonight's lecture possible. So we're grateful to each of them and representatives from quite a number of the institutions who are here with us this evening. For many of you, the Reverend Professor Howard Snyder will need little introduction. Most significantly, in my own life and in the life of the Manchester Wesley Research Center, he has recently served for 2 years as visiting director of the center while I was on research leave, and I'll always be profoundly grateful to he and his wife Jan both for that, who made 4 visitors, spending about 6 months of their lives here over the last couple of years. And during this time made a wonderfully positive impact on the life of the center and the larger community at Nazarene Theological College in Manchester as well. Howard continues to serve the center as the international representative of the center. His most recent example of that is his interactions with several Wesleyan institutions during some time that he recently spent in Argentina. Now, going back in time, Howard was professor of Wesley Studies at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto from 2007 to 2012. Before that, he was professor of the history and theology of mission at the E. Stanley Jones School of World Mission and Evangelism at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. That was from 1996 to 2006. He's also taught at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, and North Park Theological Seminary, and he's pastored churches in Chicago and Detroit. Howard was born in the Dominican Republic to U.S. missionary parents He's a graduate of Spring Arbor Junior College in 1960, Greenville College in 1962, and Asbury Theological Seminary in 1966. He completed his doctorate in historical theology at the University of Notre Dame in 1983. From 1968 to 1975, he served as a pastor and a seminary professor in Sao Paulo, Brazil, with the Free Methodist Church. Howard has spoken frequently at colleges, seminaries, and conferences, including the 1974 Lausanne Conference on World Evangelism in Switzerland. He's done short-term teaching in Brazil, Singapore, India, and other countries, and in 1993, he and his wife, Jan, visited 13 countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, studying the renewal of the church. Howard is an ordained elder in the Ohio Conference of the Free Methodist Church, and he and Jan currently reside in Wilmore, Kentucky. And they have 4 married children and 13 grandchildren. Many of you will be familiar with his now classic books, The Problem of Wineskins, 1975, The Community of the King, 1977, and The Radical Wesley, 1980. The last two been revised in recent years, and Models of the Kingdom, 1991. Some of his more recent publications are Salvation Means Creation, Healed, 2011, Jesus and Pocahontas, Gospel, Mission, and National Myth, 2015, and Rooted in Mission, the founding of Seattle Pacific University from 1891 to 1916, as well as in 2016, Small Voice, Big City, the Challenge of Urban Mission. Howard, I invite you now to deliver your lecture to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jordan, and Professor McGonigal, and guests, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have this opportunity to think together about Wesley's theology, particularly around the theme of providence. Shortly after Donald Trump became President of the United States, shortly after that narrowly contested election, the pastor of a successful church in the Wesleyan tradition wrote this. He says, whether or not we happen to like or agree with Donald Trump, the Lord has given us the leader we have, just as he's given us the president before him, and the one before him, and the one before him. So we can rejoice, not so much in any human leader, but in the God who raises up leaders. To many Christians, this sounds self-evidently true. What this pastor was referring to, without using the word, is God's providence. Providence was a major concern of John Wesley, as we know. God works providentially. This Wesley firmly believed, and Wesley gave a lot of thought to the matter. But there's a major flaw in the pastoral comment I just quoted. This view of God's sovereignty is closer to an Islamic or even a fatalistic view than to the biblical view. Are we to say in an unqualified way, God has given us the leaders we have? Should we say this then of people like Hitler or Stalin or other tyrants in history? No, this is a distorted view of God's sovereignty and of his character that veers fatalism. It's an insult to God's sovereignty and an abdication of human responsibility, especially Christian responsibility. Of course, God is sovereign and works providentially. But he doesn't always intervene, at least not immediately, to overcome or counteract human self-seeking or idolatry or plain stupidity. We need a much more robust and biblical understanding of God's character, his power, and his works of providence and grace, to use John Wesley's phrase. The aim of this lecture is to explore what Wesley believed and taught about providence, its relationship to God's grace, and the implications of that for Christian life, holiness, and discipleship. John Wesley noted in his journal for Sunday, 14 January 1776, that he was finishing his concise history of England. In his preface, Wesley said he had deleted, quote, 10,000 dull passages from his sources and inserted various references to in history. This is one of many reminders that Wesley held a providential view of all history, from creation onwards. History wasn't just a matter of chance and random happenings, nor solely of human choice, nor blind fate. Neither was it totally controlled or dictated by God. Wesley believed in genuine human freedom. How Wesley reconciled his view of divine sovereignty, human freedom, and the course of history are issues that we will confront here. This lecture focuses specifically on two matters: the relationship between grace and providence in Wesley's theology, and what this pairing of grace and providence suggests about the larger structure of his theology. That is, what Wesley's discussion of grace and providence in relation to each other reveals about his theological enterprise. So we're going to look first at John Wesley's view of providence. I begin with a comment that Wesley makes in his explanatory notes upon the Old Testament. This is his first reference to providence in the explanatory notes. It's part of his extended comment on Genesis 1:1. Here Wesley describes the process by which God created the world. He writes, "The Creator could have made his work perfect at first, but by this gradual proceeding he would show what is ordinarily the method of his providence and grace." Now notice this phrase, the method of his providence and grace. Frequently when Wesley speaks of providence, he does so in relation to grace. Much has been written about Wesley's doctrine of grace, but comparatively less about his view of providence. In fact, books on Wesley's theology are more likely to have a discussion of predestination than of providence. In this lecture, we want to see how Wesley understood providence and why he so often links it to grace. Wesley has only one sermon specifically on providence, Sermon 67, entitled On Divine Providence. He very frequently refers to providence throughout all his writings, however, not only in sermons, but also in his journals and letters, his various books and pamphlets, and his explanatory notes on the Bible. Albert Outler noted in his introduction to Wesley's Sermon on Divine Providence that this was, quote, one of Wesley's favorite themes. Wesley himself wrote, "There is scarce any doctrine in the whole compass of revelation which is of deeper importance than this." We should perhaps note at the beginning that although the word providence is often viewed as a theological term, its basic meaning is very commonplace. For Wesley, providence simply means all the ways God provides, the provisions he makes in creation, history, and in his dealings with humankind in order to show his goodness and accomplish his purpose. Providence, then, is an abstract noun used to designate all the ways God provides or makes provision for his world and his creatures. Wesley generally uses the term providence specifically to affirm that God has graciously provided, continues to provide, and will assuredly provide all the means necessary for fulfilling all his intentions and promises for his creation, and specifically for human beings. In this sense, Wesley's focus is much more on the fact of providence than on providence as a doctrine. Let's look briefly at Wesley's Sermon on Divine Providence. The text for the sermon is Luke 12:7. "Even the very hairs of your head are all numbered." There's nothing particularly unusual about Wesley's doctrine of providence, Outler suggests. Wesley held the traditional Anglican view, and his sermon on providence is, quote, in direct line with the classical Anglican statements of the doctrine, as Outler says. Yet we should note some distinctively Wesleyan accents. Most broadly stated, the doctrine of providence declares, Wesley notes, that all things, all events in the world are under the management of God. Many people, not just Christians, believe in divine providence in this general sense, Wesley says. But Scripture gives us a fuller view, though necessarily adapted to our limited human understanding. Jesus said, "Even the hairs of your head are all numbered." Wesley says this statement need not imply that God does literally number all the hairs that are on the heads of his creatures, but it is a proverbial expression implying that nothing is so small or insignificant in the sight of men as not to be an object of the care and providence of God, before whom nothing is small that concerns the happiness of his creatures. The point, in other words, is not the literal number of hairs on our heads, but the fact that even the smallest things in our lives are of concern to God, especially if they affect our well-being. In this sermon, Wesley demonstrates what today might be called a deep ecological sense. This comes out clearly in his magnificent statement about the complexity and connectedness of the created order and God's sovereign knowledge of all he has made. So he writes this: the omnipresent God sees and knows all the properties of all the beings that he hath made. He knows all connections, dependencies, and relations, and all the ways wherein one of them can affect another. In particular, he sees all the inanimate parts of the creation, whether in heaven above or in earth beneath. He knows how the stars, the comets, or planets above influence the inhabitants of the earth beneath, what influences the lower heavens with their storehouses of fire, hail, snow, and vapors, winds, and storms have on the planet, and what effects may be produced in the bowels of the earth by fire, air, or water, what exhalations may be raised therefrom, and what changes wrought thereby, what effects every mineral or vegetable may have upon the children of men. All these lie naked and open to the eye of the Creator and Preserver of the universe. Wesley then goes on to extend this vast reach of God's knowledge to all living creatures, including humankind. The point is, God knows all creation in its most intimate, intricate details. He is sovereign over all creation and all its interconnected processes. This includes God's awareness of everything that living creatures feel. For God, quote, sees all their sufferings with every circumstance of them. And very importantly, God not only knows, he understands and cares even more than a mother cares for her own children. Considering what Wesley calls the complicated wickedness and the complicated misery that we see all around us, it is hard to believe and comprehend this, Wesley says. And yet the Bible affirms that God is loving to every man and his mercy is over all his works. We are sure, therefore, that God is concerned every moment for what befalls every creature upon earth, and most especially his human creation. Given God's love and his sovereign power, one is logically bound to believe in God's good providence, Wesley argues, despite the difficulty of understanding it. And so Wesley affirms of God, quote, he is infinite in wisdom as well as in power, and all his wisdom is continually employed in managing all the affairs of his creation for the good of all his creatures. For his wisdom and goodness go hand in hand. They are inseparably united and continually act in concert with almighty power for the real good of his creatures. God certainly has the power, Wesley affirms, to destroy all sin and pain in a moment, to abolish wickedness out of his whole creation. But this would involve God denying himself, opposing and overturning his own work, since God created man and woman in his own image with understanding, will, affection, and liberty, attributes which are necessary for both holiness and evil to exist in the world. If God were to suddenly abolish all evil, Wesley writes, there would certainly be no more vice, but it is equally certain neither could there be any virtue in the world. Wesley elaborates, God cannot destroy out of the soul of man that image of himself wherein he made him. And without doing this, he cannot abolish sin and pain in the world. Abolishing evil from the world would imply no wisdom at all, but barely a stroke of omnipotence. Whereas all the manifold wisdom of God, as well as all his power and goodness, is displayed in governing man as man, not as a stock or a stone, but as an intelligent and free spirit capable of choosing either good or evil. Herein appears the depth of the wisdom of God in his adorable providence, in governing men so as not to destroy either their understanding, will, or liberty. Thus, the whole frame of divine providence is so constituted so as to afford man every possible help in order to his doing good and eschewing evil, everything which can be done without turning man into a machine, without making him incapable of virtue or vice, reward or punishment. Wesley employs the model, not original with him, of a threefold circle of divine providence. He says the outermost circle includes the whole race of mankind, not only Christians, but also Muslims and those of other religions or no religion. For God, he said, is unquestionably the God of Muslims and heathens also, for God's love is not confined. The Lord is loving unto every man, and his mercy is over all his works. The second, smaller circle includes nominal Christians for whom God has a nearer concern. The third, innermost circle, however, contains only the real Christians, Wesley says, those who worship God in spirit and in truth. God is concerned for everything about them, both their souls and their bodies. Wesley says nothing relative to these is too great, nothing too little for his attention. He has his eye continually upon every such believer and upon every circumstance that relates either to their souls or their bodies, either to their inward or outward state, wherein either their present or eternal happiness is in any degree concerned. Wesley makes a point of denying the distinction between general and particular providence. Deists could affirm a general providence, but not a particular one. Well, that's nonsense, Wesley says. Every general situation necessarily involves particulars. And in fact, God is concerned with and involved with every particular of our lives. From this exposition of God's providence, Wesley draws four summary conclusions. First, we may confidently put our whole trust in God, who never fails those who seek him. Secondly, we give thanks to God for all his kind protection. What an unspeakable blessing it is to be the peculiar care of him that has all power in heaven and earth. Third, meanwhile, we should take the utmost care to walk humbly and closely with our God. We should be as earnest and diligent in the use of the means of grace that God gives us as if we were our own protectors. Fourth, finally, we recognize what a melancholy condition people are in who do not believe there is any providence. This view of divine providence undergirds Wesley's many references to providence in his other writings. In developing this lecture, I thought it would be illuminating to focus especially on two relatively neglected or underused works of Wesley, his explanatory notes upon the Old Testament and his four-volume concise history of England. Both these works come from relatively late in Wesley's ministry and therefore presumably represent his mature thought. Both deal with the question of God's providential superintendence of history in the Old Testament and in British history. So first in the Old Testament, Wesley frequently mentions providence throughout his three-volume explanatory notes upon the Old Testament, first published in 1765-66. This work has been called probably the least known and most neglected of Wesley's writings. Wesley refers to God's providence more than 225 times in his Old Testament notes. Taken together, these comments give a fairly comprehensive view of the ways Wesley understood God's providential governance of both creation and history. In preparing this work, Wesley drew primarily on Matthew Henry's exposition of the Old and New Testament and Matthew Poole's annotations upon the Holy Bible. Wesley, however, put more emphasis on God's providence than did his sources. Many, if not of Wesley's comments on providence, come directly from him, not from his sources. We can note first the way Wesley uses the term providence in the Old Testament notes. Often he uses the term providence, usually capitalized, simply to mean the Lord God, a usage that was common in his day. More often, however, he speaks of providence, usually not capitalized, as God's universal active government over all creation. The terms Wesley uses to describe providence in his explanatory notes upon the Old Testament show clearly how important this emphasis was to him and the profundity of divine providence as Wesley understood it. Wesley uses more than 20 terms to describe providence. For instance, he describes God's providence as wonderful, watchful, almighty, perfect, merciful, mysterious, unsearchable, holy, faithful, just, kind, good, universal, all-seeing, exact, and all-disposing. Half a dozen times or more, he also speaks of the works, the ways, or the methods of God's providence. But the three phrases Wesley uses most often in the Old Testament notes in describing providence are wise, powerful, and gracious, each approximately 10 times. And of all these terms, God's wisdom is Wesley's principal emphasis. If we combine the phrases wise providence and wisdom of God's providence in the Old Testament notes, we find that more than 20 times Wesley associates providence with wisdom. Although God's providence is an expression of his power, grace, and holiness, providence is above all the evidence and expression of his wisdom. Concerning providence, then, Wesley's appeal is most especially to God's wisdom. We now turn to some key passages in the explanatory notes upon the Old Testament, where Wesley elaborates his view of providence. Of the more than 200 references in the Old Testament notes, I've selected 4 especially important ones. So some key statements on providence. 4 key comments on providence come fairly early in the Old Testament notes, 3 in Genesis and 1 in Numbers. In Genesis 1:1, Wesley affirms that God works gradually and progressively through grace and providence. We've already noted Wesley's first comment on God's providence in his note on Genesis 1:1. Here Wesley describes the process by which God created the world, noting the Creator could have made his work perfect at first, but by this gradual proceeding he would show what is ordinarily the method of his providence and grace. We may note 3 things about this reference. First, as already noted, it's significant that in his first mention of providence, he links it with grace. Secondly, Wesley sees God working gradually over time to accomplish his purposes. This was true in the initial creation, and Wesley will argue that this is true all down through history. This is a key meaning of God's providence. God patiently and wisely works over time to accomplish his purposes and fulfill his promises. By implication, as we see this in creation and in history, so we should expect the same dynamic in our own lives, the gradual, progressive work of God's gracious power. Third, we note here the phrase, ordinarily, the method God uses. Repeatedly in his writings, Wesley will refer to the ordinary and the extraordinary ways in which God acts. Normally, most of the time, God works ordinarily, that is, consistently with the way God created the world and humankind. But God is sovereign and infinitely wise, and at times acts in extraordinary ways to achieve his purposes. These 3 points are fundamental to all Wesley's theology. God works progressively in history to accomplish his purposes, working his providence. Another example is from Numbers 21. Here Wesley affirms that God works far in advance of events. Commenting on Israel's encounter with the Amorites in Numbers 21, Wesley says, "See the wisdom of providence, which prepares long before for the accomplishing of God's purposes in their season." This is a theme that runs throughout Wesley's discussion of providence. God works far in advance to fulfill his purposes at the proper time. Providence is seen, generally in hindsight, in occurrences which happened as they did partly because of God's actions much earlier in history. This is, of course, consistent with what we see throughout the biblical revelation. God works progressively through history so that events happen in the fullness of time because of God's prior action. Note that I said events occur as they do partly because of God's earlier actions. Wesley gets a lot of mileage out of the word partly in his Old Testament notes. He frequently uses the language of partly this, partly that, to emphasize multiple causation and influences. A good example concerns Queen Jezebel, 1 Kings 19. Jezebel sent word to the prophet Elijah that within 24 hours she would have him killed. She sent this word, Wesley says, partly out of the height of her spirit, partly out of her impatience, and principally from God's all-disposing providence, so that Elijah could escape. Wesley says, "The providence of God hath secret but gracious designs in all its various dispensations. We cannot conceive the projects of providence till the event shows what it was driving at." Comment on Genesis 15:7. As Wesley repeatedly says, there is a mystery to God's providence. Another example, in Genesis 6 and Genesis 9, Wesley refers to God's covenant of providence. God says to Noah in Genesis 6:18, "I will establish my covenant with you." This covenant is then elaborated after the flood in Genesis 9, which specifies that this is an everlasting covenant, not only with Noah and his family, but with the whole earth and all its creatures. Wesley calls this the covenant of providence. The covenant of promise that the course of nature shall be continued to the end of time. Noah and his sons were thus, Wesley said, made trustees for all this part of creation. Wesley does not elaborate this covenant in detail, but in his introduction to the chapter, he also calls this the covenant of providence. He does make the significant comment on Job 5:23 that, quote, "Our covenant with God is a covenant with all the creatures that God has made." And then another example from Genesis 45, the phrase wheels of providence. Wesley uses several metaphors and analogies in speaking of divine providence. We find in Genesis 48:8 what seems to be Wesley's primary metaphor, wheels within wheels. Speaking of God's providential working through the life of the patriarch Joseph, Wesley writes this: "How admirable are the projects of providence, how remote its tendencies, what wheels are there within wheels, and yet all directed by the eyes in the wheels and the spirit of the living creature." The image comes, of course, from Ezekiel. Interpreting the wheels in Ezekiel as a symbolic picture of God's providence was not original with Wesley. He would have found this interpretation in his major source on Ezekiel, Annotations upon the Holy Bible by Matthew Poole. And it likely goes back well before that. Poole says that God's, quote, "providences concerning the lower world are represented by the wheels and their motions." A comment from Ezekiel 1. Wesley, however, expands the metaphor, giving it his own interpretation and emphasis. Wesley writes that, quote, "the dispensations of providence are compared to the wheels of a machine, which all contribute to the regular motion of it." In a comment in Ezekiel 1:15. And he elaborates, "Providence orders changes. Sometimes one spoke of the wheels uppermost, sometimes another. But the motion of the wheel on its own axle tree is still regular and steady. And the wheel is said to be by the living creatures who attend to direct its motion. For all inferior creatures are and move and act as the Creator by the administrations of angels directs and influences them. Visible effects are managed and governed by invisible causes. Wesley refers again to wheels of providence in his comments on Ezekiel 3:13 and 10:11. The mention of wheels in 10:10, Wesley says, intimates the references of providence to each other and their dependencies on each other and the joint tendency of all to one common end, while their emotions appear to us intricate and perplexed, yea, seemingly contrary. In his explanatory notes upon the Old Testament, Wesley says much more about providence than we have time to deal with here. But these examples give a good sense of his overall conception of providence and its importance for Christian discipleship. And then there is God's providence in British history. God's providence in British history. Wesley published his plain-spoken, concise history of England, he said, in order to provide a fair and balanced thread of the narration of British history. Wesley was aware how difficult this is. He commented at one point that, quote, it is seldom in the power of man to raise himself entirely above the prejudices of the age in which he lives. Wesley wrote in the preface that his history was based largely on the writings of Oliver Goldsmith, Tobias Smollett, and Paul de Rapine. Omitting much dull or insignificant material, Wesley included important incidents, he said, which tend either to improve the understanding or to inspire the heart with noble and generous sentiments. He praised historians who provide full details, quote, of those striking incidents which have a tendency either to improve the understanding or to amend the heart. Wesley's historical narration, as all his theology and publishing, was thus aimed at both head and heart. His goal was to provide the kind of balanced judgment that, he said, a liberal education should provide. Wesley was thus concerned with more than simply demonstrating God's providence. Yet he complains of other histories of England. Who would gather from these accounts, who would have the least suspicion that it is God who governs the world, that his kingdom ruleth over all, in heaven above and in earth beneath, that he alone changeth the times and seasons, removeth kings and setteth up kings, and disposes all things by his almighty power according to the counsels of his will. Since Wesley's history of England is largely derivative, material condensed or extracted from other writers, it's easy to dismiss as insignificant as a work of history, merely a popular rehash. Largely for this reason, it has received almost no attention from historians to date, Thomas Smith noted in 2015. Recently, however, some significant studies of Wesley as historian, and specifically of his concise history of England, have appeared. Professor William Gibson has shown that Wesley's concise history is based not only on the writings of others, but also on research which Wesley undertook on specific topics that interested him, and that it includes original commentary and opinions by Wesley, Gibson notes. He writes, it is clear from internal evidence that Wesley did much wider reading in preparing his history than has hitherto been acknowledged. Similarly, Professor Jeremy Black, in his recent reassessment of Wesley's concise history, writes, Wesley's history deserves attention precisely because it is not original, but reflects so interestingly on a widespread engagement with the moral quality of the past. My focus here is Wesley's stated aim to show God at work in human history. Clearly, Wesley intended to offer a providential view of England's past. Given the stated aim, it's interesting that Wesley makes relatively few explicit references to providence in his 4-volume history. As Professor Gibson noted, surprisingly, given Wesley's goal of restoring God to accounts of history, there are few direct references to divine intervention in Wesley's concise history. This is less surprising, however, when seen in the context of Wesley's nuanced view of divine providence. Citing a few of Wesley's explicit references gives a sense of his viewpoint. An early instance is the arrival of Augustine of Canterbury and his missionary colleagues in England in the late 6th century. Wesley says, "Some favorable circumstances seemed providentially to prepare the way for their arrival." In the next several pages, he tells the story, noting factors that made Augustine's mission particularly timely. A second example concerns the death of William the Conqueror in 1087. In Wesley's telling, William, in a military campaign, took the town of Metz, France, which he reduced to ashes. Before the flames were extinguished, he entered the town. But his horse, chancing to place his forefeet on some hot ashes, remarkable providence, plunged so violently that the rider was thrown forward and bruised upon the pommel of the saddle to such a degree that he was obliged to return to Rome. Finding his illness increase and being sensible of his approaching death, he began to turn his eyes to a future state and died shortly thereafter. This story of the hot ashes has been widely circulated. Whether or not it is true, it shows Wesley's view of providence. God may use small, seemingly chance or random events to bring about large effects. A third example concerns the death of King William II on 2 August 1100, which Wesley saw as providential. Wesley, setting out to hunt in the New Forest, was warned by a monk not to proceed with the hunt. The monk had had a warning dream the night before. William ignored the advice, suggesting that the monk, quote, have more favorable dreams in the future. Toward the end of the day, William saw a stag and shot an arrow, wounding the animal. When the stag ran off, William attempted to follow on foot. Just then his hunting companion let fly an arrow which, glancing from a tree, struck the king to the heart. He dropped dead instantly. This, in Wesley's view, was a providential event to put an end to all William's ambitious projects. A final example comes from Wesley's own lifetime. It concerns Charles Edward Stuart, 1720 to 1788, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and the abortive Jacobite insurrection of 1745. Wesley recounts in some detail Charles' attempt to gain the English throne, including his defeat at the Battle of Culloden that essentially ended the Jacobite threat. Wesley comments that from the beginning, quote, Providence seemed no way favorable to Charles. When he first set sail from France for Scotland, intent upon the conquest of all Britain, his convoy, a ship of 60 guns, was so disabled by an English man of war that it was obliged to return to Brest. Here Wesley cites no remarkable, seemingly chance incident, but rather sees the whole chain of events as providential. Although Wesley clearly wants to give a providential view of English history, I am struck with the modesty of his claims of providential intervention. He is wary, it seems, of overemphasizing providence, of attributing to God events which, even if unusual, do not seem to him to be specifically providential. At the end of the final volume, he adds no conclusion emphasizing God's providential role in history. He seems to feel that the narrative speaks for itself if simply and plainly told from a Christian rather than a deistic or atheistic perspective. Combining Wesley's observations on God's providence in both Old Testament and British history underscores the central importance of providence in Wesley's theology. But this leads to the question, why? Why was divine providence so important to Wesley? And here I'd like for us to think a bit about providence in relation to predestination. Wesley seldom passed up a good opportunity to mention God's providence and to praise God for it. Why is this? One key reason is that providence is Wesley's answer to the question of predestination. Providence is inherently bound up with the question of predestination. This was recognized by Jacob Arminius, who treated predestination as a topic within the larger doctrine of providence. If we understand the doctrine of providence correctly, the question of predestination falls into proper place. Clarify the doctrine and dynamics of providence, and you've largely solved the conundrum of predestination. At issue here is, in part, the question of the so-called decrees of God. Calvin understood predestination as a fundamental divine decree. The New Testament, however, hardly ever uses the language of decree when speaking of salvation. Following the New Testament example, Wesley himself seldom uses the language of God's decrees. Rather, he emphasizes God's providence. The language of decrees is static, once-for-all decisions that affect all of salvation history. The language of providence is dynamic. God works salvation not through decrees, but through his constant ongoing engagement with his creation, with history, and with people's lives. In other words, God graciously provides rather than autocratically decrees. Providence thus functions in Wesley's theology the way decrees and thus predestination do in Calvin's theology. As Herbert McGonigal has pointed out, Wesley believed, quote, Christian doctrine could be expressed without having recourse to decrees at all. For Wesley, providence is an underlying background conviction that fills the place in his theology that predestination does in Calvin's. You don't need Calvinistic predestination if you have a sufficiently robust view of providence. Here we have then a key point in understanding Wesley's theology, both its content and its structure. In Wesley's theology, providence takes the place that predestination fills in Calvin's theology. Where Calvin appeals to predestination in explaining salvation, Wesley appeals to providence. This is a crucial point of difference between Calvin and Wesley, despite many areas where they agree. The difference, however, it is fundamental. It has to do with the very character of God. Both Wesley and Calvin uncompromisingly affirmed God's sovereignty, but they stressed different aspects or dimensions of God's character. For Calvin, the key attributes of God when considering salvation were God's will and power. God's sovereignty is seen primarily in the exercise of his sovereign power and sovereign will in predestining some people and not others to salvation. From this perspective, the most important thing about God is his majestic sovereign power and will. And from this comes Calvin's emphasis on the decrees of God. For Wesley, the key attributes of God, especially when considering salvation, but also more broadly, are God's holy, gracious love and his wisdom. Thus, God's sovereignty is seen primarily in the exercise of his sovereign love and sovereign wisdom in providing salvation for all, not just some, without any compromise on divine sovereignty. From this perspective, the most important thing about God is his sovereign wisdom and love. From this comes Wesley's emphasis on God's provision of salvation for all. In other words, his doctrine of providence. This explains why Wesley speaks primarily of God's wisdom when he describes God's providence. Wesley's concern to counteract the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination, in fact, helps explain, I think, his constant stress on providence. Over and over again in his writings, where Calvin would appeal to predestination, Wesley affirms God's providence. Not so much God's will, but his love. Not so much God's power, but his wisdom. Not God's decrees, but his gracious provision. Both Calvin and Wesley, of course, emphasized other aspects of God's character. They spoke of other divine attributes, and here they were largely in agreement. The issue is one of emphasis or primacy, particularly with reference to the doctrine of salvation. In my view, Wesley's deep sense of God's providence embodies a higher and more profound and nuanced conception of God's sovereignty than we find in Calvin. Wesley's view of divine sovereignty is more profound because it affirms both God's sovereign power and human freedom, based not primarily on God's power and decrees, but on God's wisdom and love. Wesley saw the riches of God's wisdom as meaning that God is not threatened by human freedom because God is infinitely wiser and more loving than human beings are. God's wisdom, beyond our comprehension, allows him always to foresee human action and act graciously in ways that counteract any human action that might prevent God from accomplishing his gracious purposes and fulfilling all his salvific promises. But I want to come back now to the relationship between that Wesley constantly stresses between providence and grace. So grace and providence, the larger structure of Wesley's theology. Wesleyan theologians, it seems to me, have often slighted or underappreciated Wesley's emphasis on providence, and particularly the key role providence plays in the whole content and structure of his theology. Wesley's treatment of divine providence, in fact, illuminates the larger structure of his theology. This is seen specifically in the way Wesley so frequently and intentionally conjoins providence and grace. Wesley's linking of providence and grace shows how he understood salvation in relation to God's overall plan for his whole creation. To cite some key examples, quote, "The glory and goodness of God, the beauty and harmony of God's work, both of providence and grace, as this of creation pictured in Genesis 1, will best appear when they are perfected." And this is Wesley's comment on Genesis 1. Of salvation, Wesley says, we cannot do it without God, and He will not without us. Both the providence of God and the grace of God crown the endeavors of the obedient and the diligent. Comment on Genesis 5:14. For Wesley, God's providence and His grace work cooperatively to fulfill His purposes. Wesley says again, God aims in all the gracious methods of His providence and grace to bring us back to Himself, from whom we have revolted, and to bring us home to Himself, in whom alone we can be happy. Comment on Exodus 19:4. We should live in constant dependence upon God's providence, Wesley says, in the most difficult circumstances, and upon Christ's grace. Comment on Exodus 17:5. On Deuteronomy 8:2, Wesley comments, quote, "It is good for us likewise to remember all the ways both of God's providence and grace by which He has led us hitherto through the wilderness." We find a similar comparison and contrast in Wesley's comment on Job 4:17. Here Wesley says, slightly paraphrasing Matthew Henry, "Those who find fault with the directions of the divine law, the dispensations of the divine grace, or the disposal of the divine providence, do make themselves more just and pure than God, who, being their maker, is their Lord and owner, and the author of all the justice and purity that is in man." These citations from Wesley's Old Testament notes show that he repeatedly and intentionally links together and yet distinguishes grace and providence. This is seen most clearly in the phrases, God's works both of grace and providence, or ways of providence and grace. Comment on Deuteronomy 8:2. This pairing of providence and grace is significant. Providence and grace are to be seen in interrelationship. Joining them together adds theological and practical depth and meaning, and that considering either grace or providence separately would lack. In other words, whenever Wesley speaks of grace, providence is never far from his mind. Likewise, when he speaks of providence, he is also very conscious of God's grace. And so, as noted earlier, Wesley frequently uses the phrase gracious providence. To some degree, what Wesley says in this regard is simply a restating of classical theology, which has always spoken both God's grace and His providence. Wesley, however, put special emphasis on providence in relation to grace for reasons that I am attempting to clarify here. In Wesley's theology, the relationship between grace and providence is in fact complex. They are not the same, even though Wesley can describe God's providence as gracious. For Wesley, grace and providence function cooperatively, symbiotically. God's providence often, Wesley suggests, prepares the way for or arranges the conditions through which we may perceive and respond positively to God's grace. This also means that in Wesley, providence and prevenient grace may be said to overlap. God's providential action may shade into prevenient grace to the point that it is impossible to distinguish them. We should, in fact, expect this, since providence and grace are not things. They are not two totally different attributes or character qualities of God. Rather, these are the ways we as humans experience God's actions and influences. These terms are human language by which we attempt to understand the mysteries of God's relationship with us and his actions toward us. From the above discussion, I would draw several conclusions. First, though Wesley frequently emphasizes God's providence, he is modest and reticent in attributing specific events to providence or providential intervention. He firmly believed in God's providence, but was concerned neither to discount or downplay human agency and responsibility, nor to endorse a view of providence that edged toward fatalism. Secondly, Wesley was keenly aware of the multiplicity of factors that enter into events or human decisions. He recognized multiple conditioning causes, a mix of factors in which divine providence was a key but not the only influence. This emphasis on multiple causative or contributing factors is typical of Wesley both in the Old Testament notes and in his concise history. Events can be caused by many, many factors, and key contributing influences may be unknown to us. So we should be cautious in attributing specific events to God's providential intervention. Third, Wesley interprets God's providence in terms of God's wisdom rather than in terms of God's will or law or decrees. Consequently, Wesley emphasizes God's providence rather than predestination. Providence in Wesley functions in the place of predestination in Calvinism. For God's providence and grace are closely interrelated as expressions of God's character. In general, providence refers to God's overall governance of the world and of human life within the world, whereas grace refers more narrowly to salvation. Salvation not only in terms of human regeneration and sanctification, but more broadly the eventual redemption of all creation. Fifth, Wesley's understanding of providence demonstrates the progressive dynamism of his entire theology. Wesley's theology is progressive in the sense that God's grace and providence always lead toward the goal of all creation praising him and reaching its God-given potential. Wesley's theology is dynamic. Life in relation to God is never static. It is always changing, whether in small or larger ways. Wesley understood that dynamism is in fact the nature of God's whole creation, reflecting who God himself is. Change is built into the fabric of all that God has made. And God works within his creation to bring about his purposes and to counteract all vicious dynamism, the infectious plague of sin that corrupts the goodness and, like a cancer, misdirects the potential of humankind and the whole created order toward destruction rather than glorious fulfillment. And then sixth, in reflecting on divine providence, Wesley starts with the reality of God, not with abstract theology. His theology is determinative of his theology as a system or rational elaboration. His view of God determines the character of his theology rather than his theology determining his view and the practical implications of God and of salvation. There is thus internal consistency between Wesley's view of God's character, God's providence, and God's saving work in persons and in all creation. In sum, providence laced with grace is the larger structure of John Wesley's theology. Certainly not to the exclusion or in competition with God's love or wisdom or holiness. Rather, gracious providence is Wesley's way of speaking of the very being and character of God in relation to the entire created order. Providence and grace trace a large circle encompassing everything in creation. We have noted that Wesley occasionally uses providence, capitalized, to mean God himself, as did many of his contemporaries. The difference between Wesley and his Enlightenment or deistic contemporaries is that Wesley used providence to mean the God of the Bible, the Trinity who reveals himself in and through the creation, the God of justice, mercy, and truth, the God of holiness and salvation, revealed supremely in Jesus Christ by the Spirit, not the remote, largely absentee God of deism. In Wesley's understanding, it is our repose in divine providence, that is, our full trust and confidence in God, his character, his love, his wisdom, his justice, his holiness, that enables us to say at the end of the day, and at the end of each day, all will be well. Not all is well, for in terms of our lives and the church and history, all is not well. Yet we have confidence that at the deepest, highest level or dimension in God himself, all is well. And in the fullness of time, through Jesus Christ, by the Spirit, all will be well on earth as in heaven. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard, for a stimulating and provocative even essay. I really appreciate it. But now it's your turn to talk and to ask questions of Howard. And Howard, if you would come and who would like to go first? Yes.
I'm very grateful, Alan, for this very comprehensive survey. It particularly helped, I think, because when you get to Wesley's own reflections in his journal on his life and in early Methodist orthodoxy and so on, there is such a stress very often on particular providences, sort of God's direct intervention to save a poorish miner, tumbling down, breaking his neck, and so forth. We all know those are regularly involved with this help, and this happens. And I think we sometimes lose sight of this very balanced way, as you've shown, that Wesley is careful to think also about the natural circumstances, the human circumstances, as he does sometimes in his journal, but at other times you feel he's very strongly convinced that he has been providentially caused in this, that, and the other, and the early Methodists often feel this in their lives. You probably have further comment on this, but it's very interesting to see the bigger picture and the theological picture that this is possible.
Yes, yes, thank you for that. I've noticed, reading through Wesley's journal, that sometimes, as you say, it's very explicit, or it doesn't leave any doubt. He thinks this is providential. Other times, he'll tell a story, some event that happened, and I think, oh, he's going to refer to providence. He doesn't. He just leaves it hanging there. And, of course, the reader, you know, if reading through the eyes of faith, he thinks, I think, would say this is providential. But there, as I say, there's, on the one hand, sometimes very explicit. On the other hand, there's kind of reticence. So, interesting.
David?
Thank you, Howard. I was making a connection between this lecture and the one 2 years ago on the duty of creation. And a question was asked at the end, persistently, on the problem of evil. Now, your fifth conclusion started, I had to change my question because of the fifth conclusion on providence dealing with the problem of sin. Does Wesley actually, in his work on providence, deal extensively with the problem of evil?
Not that I've been able to determine. Actually, when I first set out to work on this, I thought that was the question I was going to answer. but that remains in the future, I guess. I have written some on it in response to Tom Ord's book. But whenever, and I wrote something once comparing his view to Clark Pinnock's view. Whenever Wesley comes up against that issue, it seems to me he always comes back to a statement something like this: "Shall not the God of all the earth do right?" So it ultimately is a reference back to the character of God, rather than attempt to give a rational or coherent answer specifically to the problem of evil. And he does, as you mentioned about in your lecture 2 years ago, he does deal with the problem of suffering and so on in the created order among animals, and many animals suffer and so on. So yeah, so that's
better than me because I avoided the question.
I tried to. So.
Anyone else? Yes.
Is there a sense of national providence that Wesley develops, particularly in his commentary on English history, or does he tend to avoid that much?
I think it's very clear, reading between the lines, that he feels that, because at one point I think he makes some comparison between British history and I can't remember, Japanese or some other history, and he doesn't quite state what seems to be in his mind, but my impression is he did see God providentially working in British history, not only in Methodism, but more broadly. Why else, write on the subject? Although he certainly would have affirmed that God works providentially through all history. But yeah, I think there's clearly a sense of a kind of uniqueness to British history in that regard.
Well, thank you.
Just kind of along those lines, with these sort of concentric circles of God's providential care, moving from general care for all humans and creatures to nominal Christians to real Christians, is that movement because of God's greater providential activity among real Christians, or is it because real Christians are more in line with God's providence?
I think it reflects the way Wesley understood how people respond to God's grace, and I think that's the underlying assumption there. God is providentially caring for all of creation, especially those who have made some steps, even if only in kind of a nominal way, but most particularly those, you can sort of trace a parallel there, I think, between prevenient grace and converting grace and sanctifying grace to some degree. So I think that's the answer, rather than some kind of a decree or decision of God in that regard. I think it's more reflective of how people have responded to His grace.
Dynamic cooperation with grace.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is, it's a coherent idea. I often think in dealing with these kinds of issues of the analogy of parenting. The parent responds differently according to the way the child responds, but also sets up parameters and so on. So there's that parallel, I think, is helpful too.
Thanks, Howard. Thinking through what you've shown in your arguments on the relation between grace and providence in Wesley's theology, how conscious are you suggesting that Wesley was of what you're explicating? Was he sort of assuming that people would draw the connections there, or would you suggest that he didn't fully work out all the implications that that you've drawn in your paper.
You mean regarding his history of England, or more generally?
Just generally.
Uh-huh. Well, I think it's clear in his history of England, he is, and he virtually says this, and it's implicit in the other writings as well. If you start with the assumption of God's love and care and engagement, you will see evidences of God's providence. If you start with a deistic or atheistic or some other kind of assumption, then you won't. So I think that's basically where Wesley leaves it. I don't know that he attempts to, go more specifically and answer that question. Am I responding to what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm thinking too, just of the larger picture in his works against Calvinism and predestination. Does he explicitly draw some of the points that he sees providence as one way that he's trying to offer an alternative to predestination, or is that something we have to read into the text?
Oh, I see. Yeah. I didn't find, this is my conclusion, I didn't find him explicitly, stating that he is talking about providence instead of predestination. The more I read about what he said about providence, the more I had the feeling, okay, this is his answer to predestination, but I didn't find he explicitly says that anyplace.
I'm still thinking about how this dynamism works out in regard to time or time continuum, or time axis. This terminology is correct in English. In Calvin, the static understanding, everything is in the eternal counsel. It's almost platonic, it's very far away, remote. How would you describe the outworking of God's providence in time and God's time axis in regard to eternity, God's foreknowledge, and the working out of that, and then everything flows into eternity again? It is more in time than in Calvin, for instance.
Yeah, the discussions on Wesley's view of predestination, of course, deal with this whole question of foreknowledge and so on. And Wesley did not believe that foreknowledge was predetermination of people's salvation. Wesley his main focus, I think you might say, is pastoral. Wesley's is talking about how we experience God. We are here now in this life. And he of course sees all of this as headed toward the new creation, as he writes in his sermon. But he doesn't deal, at least to my knowledge, he doesn't deal with the philosophical questions behind that, nor is there much of that. God is not, certainly there's no Platonic sense of God here. I mean, God is very much engaged, and that is seen in the creation all the way through. One of the things, this emphasis on progressiveness and constant change, one of the questions I asked myself, well, how does that relate then to entire sanctification in the sense of more of a point, a crisis point, or whatever? Well, I think, which wasn't your question, but I think Wesley's approach to that would be to say, history is the story of how God has been working. Both in that, there are all these specific points and points of crisis in various ways. So I think Wesley's theology, by implication, holds together those, the crisis and the process aspect. But other than that, I wouldn't know what more to say about your specific question.
Yes.
Hi, I was just actually asking relate to the main point. I just wanted to ask you, what practical lessons can we replicate from Wesley's life to work with the Holy Spirit to set this country on fire?
This is where I think the conjoining of providence and grace are important, because Wesley is constantly offering God's grace. He's constantly speaking to people to awaken a response to God's grace. And so providence is not salvation. Providence is God's working in various ways to, as I said in the paper, to provide opportunities for people to hear and respond to God's grace. We don't have, obviously, any control of providence, but we do have a stewardship of grace, as Peter says in 1 Peter 4:10. We have been given a stewardship of grace and a stewardship of the creation. And so our responsibility is to trust in God's overall providence, to be good stewards of that grace in all the ways that we can, so people can know and respond to God's grace through redemption, through the renewal of the church, through a movement of the Holy Spirit, through an awakening of the human stewardship that we have toward the created order, to the work of the gospel of the kingdom being spread around the world. So, to me, that would be the way. And in that connection, that's why I think the focus on God's grace is actually enriched by drawing this larger circle of providence around us, which also, by the way, means, just at a very practical pastoral level, providence can be a great comfort to us when things do not go the way we wish, or when we are struggling with the question of suffering and evil in the world. At least that's been my own experience. I actually find this emphasis on providence to be a spiritual help. To recognize that underneath are the everlasting arms, that God is working out His purposes and so on. And even though we can't answer those questions intellectually, yet we can trust the one through whom we have received grace and who has given us a stewardship of grace to outward toward others.
Yes.
Do you think C.S. Lewis was also reluctant to draw direct and to agree too much on providence and the direct workings of God in history? Do you think that's because both men were more concerned about practical evangelism than trying to do history as well?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
So it's probably more clear. I was confused when I read C.S. Lewis' view of history, and he almost didn't want to draw too much, too many conclusions when he studied history and trying to discern God's workings in history.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that Wesley similarly
had
an overall view of providence, but
Yeah.
didn't want to be
I suppose both had in common some degree of reaction on the one side to those who would want to see God at work in every tiny circumstance in a way that becomes almost magical in some sense. And yet, on the other hand, those who might have either an atheistic or practically deistic view. I think, again, I was surprised in the concise history of England how infrequently Wesley actually ever mentions providence or even implies providence directly. There's several places that I mentioned, but not a whole lot. So I think it's that wanting to honor God and the mystery of history and our own lives in that, without claiming too much or too little. So.
Thank you very much, Howard.
Thank you all for being here and joining us for this event. Do stay around for conversation and fellowship, and take a chance to look at the different displays that are around. Over here we have some of the treasures from the new McGonigal collection that's in the Manchester Wesley Research Centre Library now. We just celebrated that collection coming into the centre just before this event. Some materials from the Wesley Fellowship that Dr. McGonigal was involved with, and then at the back there are some of Professor Snyder's books and some other materials related to the Wesley Centre. The latest edition of Wesleyan Methodist Studies, a journal that the Centre is involved in publishing, that just came out a couple days ago, is there. So do have a look around and take away some of the brochures for the Centre and distribute those. So thank you all.
Thank you.